And thank you all for joining us today. We're so excited to be with you here in this session. As Beverly mentioned, I'm the SVP of Strategy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education, and it is my pleasure to serve as the moderator for today's session. Joining me today are Dr. John Jackson, Jasmine Gripper, and Kent McGuire, each of whom I will introduce in greater detail as they join the conversation, and that you can read about on the website for the conference. So we are so glad that you are joining us for our workshop, Justice is the Foundation, Shaping a Racial Justice Portfolio. As we get started, please introduce yourself and tell us in the chat what is your burning questions or something you'd like to share with the group. As Beverly mentioned, you can find the chat function by looking for the green button on the left-hand side of your screen. So today it's about a racial justice portfolio, and we're excited to share what we're learning and experiencing. We want to talk to you today about the difference between equity and justice funding in education. We want you to have a better sense of how we think about what portfolios should and could do to support education justice, and share with you some new tools and ways of thinking about executing on a racial justice grant-making portfolio. At this time, I'm going to ask that the poll be launched. We want to take a little bit of a sense of what you all are thinking about as you enter the dialogue today. And we encourage you to think about racial justice and where you are or your organization is in funding and where your dollars are going. So you can find the poll on the purple button on the right-hand side. We're going to ask a few questions. Some of it is about how are you thinking about defining an educational racial justice grant? What does that mean for you and your organization as you enter this dialogue? What about where is your organization on its path to having a racial justice portfolio of grant making? Are you in the beginning stages, or is your organization one that has long done this work and is already just looking for additional ways to think about it? And then finally, what do you think is most important to you and your organization now, in this moment, to advance a racial justice strategy? So we invite you to think about those questions as we start our dialogue. And we look forward at the end of this session, we will have time for some question and answers. And so please think those things through. And we look forward to sharing with you as we proceed. As part of the workshop today, we want to hear from folks who are doing this work and hear a little bit about where they think is philanthropy's role in really implementing a successful racial justice portfolio. So to start us off, I would like to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. John Jackson. John is the president and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. He has led the foundation's efforts as an intermediary working to funnel necessary philanthropic dollars and technical assistance to organizations that are closer to both the problems and solutions needed to ensure a fair and substantive opportunity to learn for all students. John has led the Schott Foundation for over 14 years and joined after a career focused on education policy within nonprofits and government. John, please help us set the context and framing for today's discussion, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and welcome to my GFE colleagues. I want to thank you for joining us along with two brilliant partners, Jasmine Gripper and Kent McGuire. As we know, over the past 2 to 3 years, we have seen a heightened call for racial equity and racial justice across the US, and rightfully so. The pain, atrocities, the failures, they have all impacted our democracy at a systems level and all of us individually. There is a cost to racism and injustice. Understanding this and our rich history over the past 30 years at the Schott Foundation, resourcing as a philanthropic organization, grassroots organizations to address education equity and education justice, we partnered with Candid, entity that collects data on philanthropic giving, to establish a baseline and get a better understanding of philanthropy's commitment to education equity and education justice. And I want to take you through just a few slides to set the context for this discussion. The first slide indicates the amount of philanthropic dollars spent from 2017 to 2019. on education. The total funding was $14 billion. And out of that $14 billion, according to the candid data, the racial equity spending was at 10%, $1.4 billion, while racial justice spending was only at less than 1%, at $109 million. When we consider them both together, that means that we've spent less, philanthropy has spent less than 11% of its total funding between 2017 and 2019 on racial equity and racial justice. This is very significant, and both are very significant, specifically as we look at racial justice. Why is it significant? Next slide. It's significant because we need both racial equity and racial justice to achieve equitable outcomes. To put it in a voting context, we can have an equitable number of voting machines, an equitable number of precinct workers. But if the climate in which voting occurs is oppressive and suppressive, we won't get an equitable outcome. To put it in a policing context, you can have an equitable number of police stations, an equitable number of officers. But if the climate in which policing occurs is oppressive and suppressive, we won't get an equitable outcome. And in the context that we often deal with, education, we know that we can have an equitable number of schools, an equitable number of teachers, but if the climate in which our young people learn in includes overrepresentation and suspension and expulsion, over police, if it's oppressive and suppressive, we won't achieve an equitable outcome. In short, we need education equity and education justice in order to achieve equitable outcomes. And that's why these data on what philanthropy is contributing to support education equity and education justice is significant. What's also significant is where the funding goes. And the data indicates that the majority of the funding is going to the Northeast, 63%. Significant is the underrepresentation of resources in the South, because we know that a majority of Black students and those most impacted by the lack of equity and justice are in the South. And so this is a charge, and the data indicates that this is an area that philanthropy collectively we must address. How we address that, that's the discussion for today. That's why I'm glad that we have our two brilliant partners, Jasmine Gripper and Kent McGuire, to take us through the conversation. So back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, John, for helping lay out the foundation of our conversation and the opportunity that sits for philanthropy to move this work forward. I'm excited to announce and tell you a little bit more about our two other speakers. Jasmine Gripper is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Quality Education, a statewide advocacy group. In her role, she has combined her experiences and talents, first and foremost as an educator, and then as a seasoned organizer. Jasmine is a powerful voice and leader in the movement for educational justice and will share with us what it is needed from philanthropy in this moment by organizations such as hers. So welcome, Jasmine. We're glad to have you with us today. In addition, Kent McGuire joins us. Kent is the Program Director of Education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. His work focuses on helping all students succeed in college, work, and civil life. Kent is a veteran leader in the national education movement for public education and will share with us today his perspectives of the role those of us in philanthropy can and should play in supporting educational justice. So thank you, Kent, for joining us as well. You can read more about Jasmine and Kent and their longer bios in the materials, and I would encourage you to do that. Both of them, as you will quickly see, have a long and rich history of advocacy and dedication to this work. And so I invite you all into the conversation and have a couple of questions to start us off. So thank you for being here. The first place to start is to talk a little bit about the racial justice movement and grant making that centers grantees. And Jasmine, I think you and your role are a key player and voice on this. And so I'd love to hear from you and have you share to the group, what does racial justice and education versus equity mean for an organization such as AQE?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So when we think about racial justice in education, we're thinking about how do we dismantle systemic racism and how it shows up in our schools, how it shows up in how our schools are funded, how it shows up in the opportunity and resources that our schools are allowed to have, and how it shows up in the school climate and discipline issues. And so those are just a few examples of how our schools have this racial climate that is disproportionately harming Black and Brown students, as well as students who are low income and LGBTQ students. And so we really work to dismantle the systems. And so I think sometimes people think of philanthropy as direct service providers, right? I have a literacy program. And a literacy program is good, but that does not create systemic reform. And so we think it's important that you do direct service and you also fund advocacy, because advocacy is where system change is able to happen.
Thank you for that, Jasmine. Your response makes me think a little bit about this piece of how we lift up some of the key voices. And even in the materials, as John talked about it, and as we introduced it, we talked about community voice and leadership. Can you share with us a little bit about how that is important in the power dynamics of the work that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. We know who the decision makers are in our schools, right? We have our principals, we have our superintendents, we have our school district officials and school boards. And oftentimes they make decisions without all the stakeholders being present. So teachers have a teachers union that represents them, but who represents the parents? Who represents the students? And how do they have their voices at the table so that they can contribute to the policies that are impacting their child's classroom? Parents are experts of their own children. And so our work is really leadership development. That is the heart of everything we do, is we particularly recruit Black and Brown parents in low-income communities. We do a whole leadership development program with our parents, and they take on leadership roles, and they are the experts driving our campaigns, and they are driving our agenda. And what we find is that once you prepare parents to own their power and they understand that the power that they have as the people, the collective power we have, you transform communities. That is lifelong change. We see our parents who have gone on. We have parents who have started their own nonprofits. We have parents who have run for school board and elected officials. And so our parents are like, yes, once they know their power, they use it. And now they are at the decision-making tables and they are transforming it from the inside out.
Jasmine, thank you for talking about lifting up those voices. And I'm curious, as you've offered that, looking to Kent and John, what are the opportunities or challenges for philanthropy to sort of lift up and empower those voices that Jasmine was just sharing with us about? I'll ask Kent to weigh in first, and then John will come to you.
Thank you. And I'm just thrilled to be here. I just want to there are a number of challenges, Diana, that we could face. They're all surmountable, but we could face these, right? For instance, if we don't know who the organizations are that are working with parents on the ground, many of us national funders were at some considerable distance from the work that Jasmine described. And so we would have to work to identify who the organizations are we might actually support. That's a solvable problem, but it's a real one. A second potential barrier is, and Jasmine could speak to this, these aren't all like super big organizations with really large budgets and lots of, built capacity. And so we might need to be more comfortable with how these organizations are built and more willing to support them in ways that actually build their capacity. This gets into our grant practices, the things we typically require, the stuff we usually ask for, and the things we're accustomed to seeing in the kinds of organizations that we support. We might see less of that, or there might be a lot more variation with regard to those things that we would want to adjust to or adapt to in order to be more supportive. So those are just two things right off the top of my head that I think we have to attend to.
I think Ken said he's not brilliant. He just does brilliant things. And the thing that I point to is he has been at Hewlett for a short period of time, but has made significant progress in connecting Hewlett's resources with education justice organizations. And he's done it in a way that I think a number of other philanthropic partners who may be challenged, or with the challenge that Kent just outlined, you don't know where the organizations are. There are a number of ways to solve for that today. Schott is an intermediary. This is the work that we have done for the last 30 years, connecting and resourcing these organizations, along with Communities for Just Schools Fund is another intermediary. If you don't know the organizations, there are now a number of national alliances that you can resource. The Alliance to Reclaim Our Schools, which Kent tapped into. Dignity in Schools, the Alliance for Education Justice, Journey for Justice. So there are ways, quick, fast, in a hurry, that foundations can brilliantly tap into supporting these education justice organizations. So I just see it as tremendous opportunity at this point.
Thank you. When I think about even what all of you have just shared and the richness of what you've raised up, I look back to you, Jasmine. Can't put it on the table. We can think about how we do our grant making process. So, what is it from your perspective that could be different about how you engage with philanthropy and the folks who are supporting you?
Yeah, so I want to say one, general operating aid is always preferred. And that speaks to like trust-based philanthropy, right? We keep hearing that word a lot. And there are some funders who are doing a really good job of that, which is like building connections. We want to just talk to you. We want to talk to your members. We want to hear what's happening from the ground. And we trust you to do what's right in the movement and in the moment. And sometimes things shift, and we want to be able to be accountable to that. What we don't want to do is like to stay operational, we have to chase grants and redefine or change our priorities. We want to be committed to the things that we're committed to. We want our parents to be able to shape the agenda on the ground. And so we kind of have to write grants that gives us the flexibility to do so. And even the ability to have someone who's a grant writer on your staff is a privilege. We are a 21-year organization. We are 21 years old. Schott has been with us from the beginning. And I think John can even speak to how through the years our relationship has changed. We used to depend on Schott for a lot of things. Like, can you help us with comm support? Can you help us with putting out a report? Can you help? And we would like always ask for help. And these are things we can now take on and do on our own. Like, we are now more mature. We have now more staffing. We have grown our budget. We have grown our capacity. And that's what you want to do with a group. You want to stick with them for the long term. You want to provide the training wheels until they're able to continue to walk. And then the other thing is like some of these fights, especially big transformational fights, take a long time. When we first connected with Schott, when AQE was started, it was around a school funding fight. There were ebbs and flows. And literally in 2021, we had a huge victory of getting $4 billion for New York's public schools. It took 20 plus years to get this victory. And sometimes we need funders to commit with us, not for these short-term projects, but really for the long haul, for systems change to work. We need you to take the time to be with us in the long fight and not to abandon us midway, and that we have to struggle to refinance and resource our movement. So we want trust-based philanthropy, stick with us for the long term, and be mindful about over demands around long proposals, long reports, and are there ways to streamline the process to make it easier for the fields?
We've talked about small organizations that are just starting out and that support and growth over time to allow them to grow and succeed. And we've also talked about, requirements of reporting back. Jasmine, what you just shared. I'm really curious, ways in which internal to the organizations, to philanthropy, as we think about traditional ways in which we make decisions around grants, the reporting requirements or the application processes. What ways, Kent, John, have you been successful in changing some of that dynamic internally around how the processes within philanthropy can better support or align with the kind of grant making support that Jasmine's talking about? Kent?
Well, that's a great question. And first thing I'd say is monitoring and reflecting on your practices is a good thing to do in general. You might even ask your grantees, whether or not these things really work for them or not. And one of the things we care about, and we ask ourselves from time to time, is, are we using the stuff that we ask our grantees for, right? And if we're not using it, we have to wonder, why are we asking for it, right? A second question we commonly ask is, are the things we are asking our grantees to do worth their time and effort, given everything else that they're up to, right? Anything we ask for that doesn't help them reflect on what they're doing, nor helps us make sense of what they're doing, is spending their money, right? In ways that we probably shouldn't, right? So now, having said that, there are things we can do. We streamline our budget templates if we need to use them. When we do what Jasmine says and create general operating support, we don't need budget templates. We just need their annual report or something like that. We sometimes waive interim reports in lieu of picking up the phone and calling Jasmine and asking her, how's it going, for crying out loud, right? Guess what? That phone call actually reveals some genuine interest in what Jasmine is doing, right? And so we sometimes realize we can learn enough through regular intermittent communication that we don't need to have them write it down sometimes, right? So I think there are things like that we can do. Hewlett has fondly what we call 7 habits of effective grant making that run the gamut from the streamlining of reporting requirements and simplification of all of that to accepting documents from some of our grantees in lieu of having them write proposals, all the way to getting to be much better listeners, so that we are more effective at understanding what is going on in the work and where our grantees might actually need our help beyond the grant dollar. Where can we amplify their voices? How can we bring them together? What can we do to help them secure additional resources from others? So all of those things, Diane, I would say fall into the realm of possibility once we've committed to trying to help these organizations generate impact.
Yeah, I think that Jasmine and Kent said it all. The only thing I would add to that is, too often in philanthropy, we trust our asset managers on the endowment side more than we trust our grantee partners. And to Jasmine's point, this is about trust-based philanthropy. The organizations and the people in the organizations are closest to the challenges, but they're also closest to the solutions. We don't need to always invest millions of dollars running regression analysis, trying to figure out what's happening in the community. We can invest those dollars with those who are in the community, and they can sort of articulate what the challenge and what are some potential solutions. That's been our relationship. And it is about trust. There will be leadership changes in the organizations. And I've heard philanthropic conversations where it's, well, the leader is changing. Do we need to pull back our investment? We trusted the organization enough, from Billy Easton, who was the former executive director there, to where Jasmine is. They made a great decision. She's doing an outstanding job, but that only comes through trust-based philanthropy and really trusting and supporting the organization for the long run.
Thank you for that. I think this piece about ongoing continued support and trust is really important. And I think it also, we haven't talked about it a lot, but I think there are times when we need to have better alignment about what we mean by impact and how we're measuring these things. And so I'm going to start actually with you, John and Kent, but I also want to hear from Jasmine about how each of you think about measuring impact. And is that different on the side of philanthropy versus the organizations driving the work? And I'd love to hear about how we more appropriately measure impact as it relates to how we're assessing where funds go and what types of funds are being sent to the organizations. So John, I don't know if you'd like to weigh in on that.
Well, I think specifically with our commitment to the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, of which, as Jasmine noted, Schott has been funding for over 20 years. The foundation was always committed to the long-term goal, understanding that there would be some short-term wins. And over the years, they have fought and changed many policies before they got the big win. Now, over those years, we've probably resourced some level, somewhere between 10 and 15 million, but we've got a $4 billion return with the win that they got from the New York legislature. We'll take those return on investments any day. And so I think there has to be some commitment to the long-term goal and understanding that there will be some short-term wins, but you can't measure your progress just by measuring short-term, because many of these challenges were not created over a generation and they're not going to be solved over a grant cycle.
I agree with all of that, Diana, but I also think there are things to be looked at in real time and over time to measure impact. Of course, I also think the question is, with respect to what? So let me elaborate on that for a second. As a grant maker, one kind of impact in this space, I think, is that we can measure is, do we observe a change in grant practices? So here I'm just linking back to my previous answer about the kinds of things we might do to make it easier to work with our grantees working in the racial justice space. A second kind of impact that we ask ourselves, we now survey, do demographic surveys and the like, is do we observe a change in the demographics of who our grantees are? What do we know about the composition of their boards, their leadership, and their staff? And I think it's a fair question. If you're serious about having greater philanthropic impact around questions of race and equity, that the diversity is, you can see it in who your grantees are, but those are things that are rather easy to monitor over time. In that same regard, sorry, I'm going to go long here, but you were worried about whether I'd just give you one-word answers, Diana. We can also reflect on how the problems we're addressing through our strategies have evolved or shifted. So those are impact measures that don't take a long time to see, and they have to do with us reflecting on our own work. Let me just say one more thing, looking out. We look at another set of questions about impact. Who's at the table in the communities that we're trying to support? Do we see changes in participation? Do the folks we think ought to have more influence or power in those conversations, do they have it? Is the participation reflected in the kinds of issues that are being taken up in one context or another? So those are things that they don't get you all the way to the outcomes that John and Jasmine were describing earlier. But if you don't see them along the way, you're much likely to see those longer term effects, to which they refer.
Yeah, I agree with everything. And I'll just add one of the things that Ken said of like paying attention to what your grantees are doing. Follow us on social media, read our e-blast, sign up, pay attention to what we're doing. It always feels comforting when a funder says, hey, I saw you were doing a statewide tour. How is it going? It's like, yes, you pay attention to our work, not just when I put it in a grant report. Like now social media is a thing. We all use it. We all share our work on it. And it feels nice when a funder actually pays attention to what we're doing online and in our e-blast. And I think the other thing is like how we measure our impact. It's literally that. It's the leadership development. It's like Ken said, that the seats at the table, or our parents being there. Who are we? Are we growing our influence and our power and our base? And we're really particular. We're not trying to grow grass tops. Like this is grassroots, right? We're building the people power, and we're building a bigger and stronger movement. And how do you measure that? Are we changing policy? Yes, that's important, but that doesn't happen every year. But are we developing leaders? Yes, always. And sometimes we do that in just a storytelling. I remember one of our leaders who didn't know who her elected representatives were. Like when we first met her, she had no idea. And now she knew. She got her state senator to host an education town hall in the community. I said, hey, we're gonna make sure we have the flyers and make sure folks can come out. She's like, don't worry, I'm gonna get his office to pay for the flyers. AQE has done enough. She had him on cell phone, she had easy access to her representative and said, hey, here's what I'm demanding from my community. You're going to come to this education town hall. You're going to hear from everyone in the community about what we want. You're going to stay for the entire time. And then this is what we want you to do in Albany. That is the kind of power we're building. Like we are saying our leaders, our parents are going to come to us. We're going to work with them and we're going to develop their leadership and the impact that they then have. Sometimes you can't capture that in a grant cycle. The impact they have is now a lifetime transformation. And that's the beautiful thing you want to see from grantees is that they're transforming lives and communities for the long haul, as opposed to puppets, right? It's not just having someone speak at a press conference and read talking points, but people who are really transformed, like they know the issue, they deeply connect to it, and they want to see it win for themselves. And as well as they have an affiliation to our organization, which is great. And they carry that everywhere they go, and they become our spokespersons. They help us to recruit more parents. And you want to see that, like, we're not dealing with the same leaders we were 10 years ago, because our leaders 10 years ago are now in really powerful positions. And we're starting to keep building all over again. And that is how we're building power. That's how we're transforming a movement. That's how we have influence in a place like New York City that is way bigger than our staff capacity ever could be.
Dan, I'd like to offer here just one blinding insight that I didn't share earlier from the grant maker side, which is, we're actually trying to learn how to do this, which is simply ask your grantees how they think about impact as a part of the process of deciding how to measure it yourself. Co-develop it, right? And my hunch is that if we have a shared sense of impact and could come to agree about how to measure it, then that actually builds the trust that we've been talking about as being so important, when we have a common understanding of what we're trying to achieve.
If I can add, I said earlier, I think that we often trust our asset managers more than we trust our grantee partners, because on the endowment side, we invest dollars with a 5-year, 10-year impact horizon. And often the case is we don't do that on the program side, which we likely should. We also have to identify, are we doing this to elevate the foundation's impact, or the in service of the work and the organizations? And at Schott, we do it in service of the organization. So when we evaluate whether or not we're having impact, is the capacity of the organization growing? And Jasmine talked about it. It's things that they were not able to do 10 years ago, they can do today. Funding relationships that they didn't have 10 years ago, they now have today. So that's an impact indicator. And ultimately, I think as philanthropic partners, it is part of our responsibility to shift the power to the organizations, the people, the individuals who, again, are closest to the challenges and the solution. And at the foundation, this is why we developed a participatory grant-making fund, the Loving Communities Fund, where our grassroots grantee partners are making decisions on where the grants should go because they know best. And ultimately, we're at the beginning of launching a racial equity endowment that is totally focused on shifting the resources, endowing them for the long run to control those resources.
Thank you for that. Thank you for all of you responding to this question of both the impact and measurement and how we all think about this. And Kent, I mean, we're going to call you brilliant again, thinking through that piece of that shared understanding. You know, Jasmine provided so much great, rich discussion of the perspective of what it is to be, you know, really directly supporting and empowering, and how that mutual understanding of impact and how you measure it is super important. We've touched on it quite a bit, but I know that many of the folks who are with us today are thinking through where their strategies are. And I'm wondering if there are any key insights. Again, you've touched on quite a bit of this, all three of you already, but you know, what is it that folks should either, you know, commit themselves to learning, if that's the space at which they're at, and or the specific elements of a strategy for racial justice education funding portfolio? What is it they need to keep top of mind, whether it be the time horizons that we've talked about, whether it be the mutual impact measurements? What would you all share as folks are thinking through this and they're grappling in real time with how to set a strategy for their portfolios?
Jasmine, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll just say this one part is that one, the work doesn't stop when we have a victory. And so I think sometimes people are like, oh, I'm going to fund the work until you get this. And that's not enough, because what we have learned is that we have to protect our victories. If we're not still around doing the work to make sure the implementation is right, if we're not there to do the work to make sure we're monitoring it, then it will go away. And then so we'll have a step forward and then we'll take 2 steps back. And so part of the strategy has to be, how do we work to get to the win? And then how do we work to keep and maintain the win? And sometimes that's harder. Like literally we find ourselves, we want all this money for schools, the federal government is investing. Now what do? We're not monitoring how 700 school districts are spending billions of dollars. But we need to make sure it's being spent well. Literally, like today, I'm like, we have an issue in Rochester. We won cops out of schools, and now they're trying to say we want the cops back in the schools. And we're like, no. And so it doesn't stop once we have a victory. We have to keep going. We have to keep growing, and we have to keep building power. And so part of the strategy, again, isn't just a campaign. It isn't like, we catch on to some cliche, schools not jails, counselors not cops, and it's a commitment to ongoing organizing, a commitment to long-term transformation, and a commitment to really shifting and building power. And when you have that as your core, or that as your North Star, you will end up funding the right people, the right work, and the right transformational change that is going to keep going bigger and bigger, as opposed to one and done, and you come back 5 years and you realize it's all gone and we no longer have the victory that we thought we had.
Two different thoughts here, I think. The first, I just want to piggyback on Jasmine's comments, mostly to point up what I think is a real tension from the philanthropic side, right? I agree with everything Jasmine said. And at the same time, what I know about organized private philanthropy, most of us are in the leverage business more than the maintenance business, by which I mean we're built to go after particular problems, and we're incentivized to identify where the leverage in solving that problem is. And I think we're learning to stay with the problem as long as it takes to move on it, right? But that's not the same thing as saying we're just going to pick this organization and we're going to fund them until the cows come home. And so there is, I think, an example of a tension between what's needed and the incentives that are operating, on organized philanthropy, at least some of the time. That's one thing I wanted to say. Here's the other thing I wanted to say to your question about things we might need to do. I actually think sometimes what we need to do is we need to do our own work around questions of race. So for instance, we've been in a year-long learning journey, just my team, making sure that we can talk about these things with one another, that there's a level of candor and trust developed internally. Because John, if we can't develop it internally, why would you expect us to be able to develop it externally with people in the field, right? So we have a lot of practice to do to make sure we're on the same page about that. Now we're turning, literally in the next several months, to asking ourselves a set of questions about how do we show up in the field given what we say we value, right? So my sense, Diana, is that the extent to which we're doing our own work, we're likely to be better set up to be effective in working with folks in the field on these issues.
Yeah, I agree. As a member of the Nellie Mae Foundation board, before Nellie Mae transitioned to this racial equity strategy that they are in at this point, there was a year-long learning agenda that the board members were engaged in outside of board meetings. So Kent, you're absolutely right. That work has to happen. And, if you ask the question, what do you need to learn? I would say you need to learn the people who are actually doing the work. And for some, regional or local foundations, you may be able to identify them and really go there and have a conversation, meet them. You can't help people that you're not willing to talk to or touch. And you want to be in partnership with them. And to the degree that you don't know those organizations, we talked about it. There are now intermediaries and others that you can learn about within philanthropy to help you with that journey. And I agree with you, Kent. It's not just about identifying an organization and saying we're just going to stay with them forever, but it is about the leverage, and it is using more of a venture capital type of concept. They are too significant to us, too significant to the work to fail. We've heard of too big to fail. They're too significant to fail. So we are connected for the long run, asking the question, what else do they need so that they can produce the types of impacts that are necessary and hit the leverage points that are necessary for us to make meaningful gains?
And I do want to say organizations do have to grow, right? Like John said, the executive director we had 14 years ago is clearly not the executive director now, and there was a transition process. Our leadership has changed, our development has changed. And again, so a commitment to an organization that's still is bettering themselves and still being impactful are the things you want to look for. What you don't want to see is stagnation, and that's problematic. I think the term people say is sometimes founderitis, right? Someone who's been there and they refuse to let go. How are folks grooming the next generation of leaders and building even a transition process? Like our transition process wasn't a surprise; it was planned, it was intentional, and it was built with the intent that I would have with the skills I needed to succeed, right? And that's what you want to see. Are people stepping back from power and making room for the next generation of leaders to step up? And those are key signs that the movement will live on, that this organization is going to continue to grow and be impactful, as opposed to we're going to self-implode because we refuse to shift with the times or shift to what's necessary in this moment.
Thank you all for your comments and for this dialogue. It's so important. And as we're moving towards the close of our time, I just want to share with the folks who are with us that we're going to open it for 1 or 2 questions as our time permits. So if you'll take a moment to look into the chat or perhaps submit your question, there's a green button on the left-hand side that should allow you to submit a question to us. And as we close, I do have one last sort of question that we probably could spend 15 minutes on in and of itself, but I am thoughtful about what Kent, you mentioned about the learning that your organization, your team has been going through, the ability to build trust within our own groups as well as looking externally. I just also think about what a difficult 18 months it's been for the nation, but also for the world, a global pandemic. We're talking about the racial reckoning and what was a critical moment for a lot of folks in the country to think about race differently, or in ways that many of us have been thinking about it longer. I think about, and I've had the pleasure of listening to Jasmine share about what it means to care for oneself when you're doing such deep and important work and you're having difficult dialogues, whether it be externally in your advocacy or even amongst your peer groups and colleagues. And so, I just want to offer a moment to let any of you respond to sort of what you think about in terms of care or the ability to sustain one's own self, whether it's within an organization, whether it's philanthropy or, within an organization that's doing more direct support of empowering groups. How do you think about that, or what would you offer to this group to think about in terms of supporting one another and themselves?
Well, I'll just +1 your question, Diana. I do think, well, there is a small numbers problem in philanthropy in terms of the number of people of color right now inside these places. And I do think I'm in this community of practice with some 40 or 50 other grant makers. And just a week ago, it was this question about how are you doing kind of surfaced. And on the one hand, people are thrilled about the moment and feel some real obligation to lean in and step up. And at the same time, people are tired, and so just the advice, to attend to some self-care, and to make connections with your colleagues and other foundations and people in the field, I think is really sound advice. Put your oxygen mask on first, as they say, before helping the person sitting next to you, because you can't do this work if you're not well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, the field is important, and there was a lot happening, and there was a lot to respond to, while also we were all dealing with a global pandemic, this unprecedented time of shutdown, of isolation that was unexpected. Yet there were these movement moments where there was a chance for a win, and there were these moments where you felt like we had to respond to, and it was a balancing act of yes, we need to move, we need to act, we need to protect things as much as possible, support our communities, and we also need to protect and guard ourselves. And so, for example, when we got past our big budget fight and we did get this big win, it was all hands on deck for our staff. These lots of late nights, lots of early days. We took a week off. We closed our office. Everyone still got paid. They didn't have to use their vacation time. And we just said, just take a break. Just stop for a week. Don't answer emails. You are excused. Even if it's a reporter, they will figure it out. We're just going to stop. And that was hard to say, right? As you were like, oh, there's so much to do, but like, people need a break. And we've been thinking about ways that we connect with each other as staff. We have like a personal built-in check-in on Thursdays, where we just talk about not work stuff. What are you watching on Hulu? What are you doing in your spare time? We're just connecting with people as human beings. And so we make room for that. And we do this work because we're passionate and we want to do it, while also people people have lives outside of the work, and there are other things that are weighing on their hearts and that they're dealing with. So we're mindful of all those things at one time. And then the last part I'll say is that, about budgets and philanthropy, it's like we want to be able to pay our people well. We want to maintain and keep our staffs. And that's really a part, like our relationship with philanthropy. Can we do that? Can we provide extra financial assistance to our employees during the pandemic? Can we support you purchasing what you need for a home office setup? And so we had to do that as well. And so there's lots of things that go into like being human, but also I think we were trying to be good employees at the time, right? Making sure everyone had what they needed. And some of our funders checked in on us, and some gave us, emergency assistance grants, which were great. But there was definitely a large demand. There was demands to meet the urgent needs of our communities. There's demands for people to actually just slow down and rest and be human. There's the work. There's the fact that there's systemic racism happening all around us and brutality. We're taking all that in. We've now added like a mental health benefit for our staff. Like we're really trying to think about what we can do to support people to have the longevity in this fight, because we know burnout is real, and that affects turnover, and that also impacts our ability to be effective. And so we can retain staff. That's really important. And we can retain them if we can pay them appropriately, and we can also make time for rest, which we think people really need.
I think Jasmine just gave us the blueprint. Next question.
Well, thank you all for your time. We didn't see any questions come in from our participants, and so we'll take that as a good sign that we've given you a lot to think about and that we've shared a lot. I want to invite those who are participating. You should see a final poll as we close out our session, and you should be able to access that at the purple button on the right-hand side of your screen. I want to thank Jasmine, Kent, John. I personally have really appreciated and learned so much from this dialogue. I'm sure that it's been incredibly impactful for all of the folks who've had the opportunity to be here. It has been a pleasure to talk about where we are in this critical moment and the ways in which we can do more to both support one another, but to support and empower and shift this dynamic, shift the power structures, and create transformational change for our education system. So I want to thank you all for sharing your insights, your perspectives, for being with us here today. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for all that you've done and that you're doing each and every day for this work. And then I'd like to turn it to John for a moment. I know that he wanted to share some final thoughts as we close out.
Yeah, I just want to again thank you, Jasmine, because you're always a motivator and inspirational. And Kent, thank you again, my mentor in government, brother in philanthropy. I learned so much from you, and I appreciate it. As we close out, I believe that love is greater than hate, but for some reason, it always seems that hate has more resources. And as one in philanthropy, this can be frustrating. So I can imagine how frustrating it could be for those youth and parent leaders who are fighting every day to institutionalize love. Providing an opportunity to learn is love. Healthcare is love. Protecting the right to vote is love. And I believe that every generation gets a moment and the momentum to further institutionalize love over hate. And while philanthropy won't lead that movement, how we respond to support it really matters. And I do believe that we're in a moment and we have the momentum at this point. And the question is, will we be bold enough in order to support those that are doing the work in order to institutionalize love? One of my greatest fears, someone asked, what do you fear about this moment, or what concerns you? My greatest concern is that one day I will meet my creator, and the creator will say that I gave you the position, I gave you the moment and the momentum, but you didn't love enough to be bold enough to make it happen. And I believe each of us will have to answer this question, whether it's from our creator or our conscious. We have the position, we have the moment, we have the momentum, we have the resources. Are we willing to be bold enough to support those young people, parents, and others who are working to institutionalize love? We're not just at foundations for the sake of being at foundations, but we're at foundations because justice is the foundation. And we can do it. It's a choice. Let's just get to work. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that, John, and a reminder of why and how we can all take stock of this moment and move forward. Thank you to our panelists for being here and for all that you've shared. Thank you to those who have been with us today. We encourage you, there's more information about Justice Is on the Schott Foundation website. So we invite you to visit there and sign up to get more information about the data that we've collected in this space. Thank you so much.